U.S. President Donald Trump has threatened to send in the military to put an end to the violence that's come alongside the protests sparked by the death of George Floyd in police custody. President Trump was speaking at the White House as police fired tear gas and rubber bullets to clear protesters nearby. Later, thousands of people marched through Brooklyn in New York City, shouting for justice. The wave of protests began after a video circulated a week ago now, showing a police officer kneeling on George Floyd's neck and ignoring his pleas that he couldn't breathe. As the protests enter their second week now, the president told mayors and governors across the country that if they do not get things under control, he'd deploy the military.
First, we are ending the riots and lawlessness that has spread throughout our country. We will end it now. Today, I have strongly recommended to every governor to deploy the National Guard in sufficient numbers that we dominate the streets. Mayors and governors must establish an overwhelming law enforcement presence until the violence has been quelled. If a city or state refuses to take the actions that are necessary to defend the life and property of their residents, then I will deploy the United States military and quickly solve the problem for them.
Let's get the very latest now from the U.S. with DW's Melissa Chan joining us from Los Angeles. Good day to you, Melissa. The president there saying he's ready to send in federal troops into U.S. cities. What have been the reactions to that so far?
Well, first of all, a lot of people had to go back into the history books to see when the last time this rarely used law was invoked. And just for viewers who don't understand, I mean, we have seen a lot of armed officers on the streets across the United States. There is a difference between the National Guard, though, in which governors are in control of, versus what President Donald Trump is suggesting, which is taking active duty military who have been working in Afghanistan and Iraq and then putting them out in the domestic United States. And I think depending on which media organization you watch, if you're an American who watches a lot of Fox News, you will definitely support what President Trump has done or has threatened to do in terms of looking at all the looting that happens in the evening and feeling like there does need to be so-called law and order. And of course, if it's a Rorschach test, if you're another kind of American, what you see is that the president has just threatened the American people with sending American soldiers to treat them like enemy combatants.
Okay, the president was talking about the looting, though, and tried to separate the peaceful protesters from, of course, the violent actors out there. That being the case, can you give us an overview? Where is the country right now after night 7 of protests and looting and arson?
Brian, I think you can make an excellent point, which is that the most dramatic pictures are not the most accurate pictures. There are far more people taking to the streets who are peaceful protesters and who have been peaceful protesters over the last few days. What happens is that night falls and looters come out, and that is a real problem. People, of course, very frustrated who've been protesting out in the streets dayside, feeling like their message is, of course, being muddied by people who are out there at night. Now, in Los Angeles, Sunday night was bad. This evening here, Monday evening, it's not as bad, but it's interesting. You have to keep in mind, Los Angeles, LA County is in what I would consider like a double lockdown. There's the lockdown for COVID because we're not as far along as Germany in terms of dealing with this pandemic. So there's a lockdown in place. And then you have the lockdown of this curfew in terms of limiting people going out at night. So it is a double sort of sense of control, and it's very overwhelming for a lot of people here.
Melissa Chan, thanks so much for following this for us today from Los Angeles. Well, the state medical examiner for Minneapolis has released an autopsy report saying that George Floyd died from suffocation while being restrained by a police officer. At the site of his death in that city, members of his family paid tribute to him with a call for unity and for peace.
Terrence Floyd crumbles under the weight of tremendous loss. This is where, for nearly 9 minutes, his brother George begged for his life and for his mother, under the weight of an officer on his neck. The medical examiner is calling his death a homicide.
What's his name? George Floyd. What's his name? George Floyd. George Floyd. George Floyd. George Floyd.
A week later, Terrence is here to memorialize his brother and to ask protesters to demand justice the right way.
I understand y'all upset. But like it was already said, I doubt y'all half as upset as I am.
Come on now. Right here. Speak.
So if I'm not over here wilding out, if I'm not over here blowing up stuff,
Come on.
if I'm not over here messing up my community, come on. Then what are y'all doing? Just like we have a left hand and a right hand, we want peace on the left and justice on the right. There you go. Peace on the left, justice on the right.
Protests have swept across the U.S., fueled by anger and desperation. George Floyd isn't the first unarmed black man or woman to die in police custody, but his slow death, caught on video, has sparked a movement. People are demanding black Americans be treated with the same humanity as whites.
I'm a mother. I can discipline you without putting my hands on you, but this is murder. So America's aborting my children.
Derek Chauvin, since dismissed from the police, was charged with Floyd's murder on Friday. But his brother says that's not enough. He wants all of the officers involved arrested and charged.
I just want to hear this again. What's his name? George Floyd. What's his name? George Floyd.
Well, DW's Alexandra von Nauman is following developments for us from Washington, D.C., near the White House. Alexandra, what's the situation like where you are now?
We are right now a few blocks away from the White House in the K Street, and the situation has calmed down here a little bit after the police cleared the streets with tear gas and rubber bullets. As you can see on my left side, those police officers surrounded a small group of protesters, most of them very young people, some of them even kids, I would say. And now they are being arrested for breaking the curfew. And you can see the police cars here on the other side. But we know that at different places in Washington, D.C., there are still protesters gathering, defying the curfew.
So arrests being made, and earlier police were firing tear gas at protesters in the street, as you say. As all this was happening, President Trump was speaking in the Rose Garden of the White House. What did he have to say?
Well, he talked a lot about restoring law and order across the U.S., and he said that he was threatening to deploy active U.S. military if the governors are not going to stop the violence. He called the violent protests acts of domestic terrorism. And even though he mentioned George Floyd and said that he was sickened by his death, he used the speech to present himself as a law and order president, and he didn't deliver the message that you may have expected, the message that could unify this nation and calm down the situation.
Well, these anti-racist protests and Trump's response are, of course, all happening in an election year in the United States. How is all this likely to affect Donald Trump's performance in November?
Well, we know that some people within the administration, some of his advisors, are concerned that the president's inability to strike the right tone, to unite the nation, to send the right message may hurt his re-election chances. But at the same time, he himself seems to believe that stressing that he is a law and order president would help him to get re-elected. However, if he's going to continue this course, it could be that he's going to lose very important voter groups, such as women and independent voters.
Alexandra von Nauman in Washington, D.C. Thank you. Well, the brother of George Floyd has appealed to protesters to remain peaceful. saying that police brutality incidents too often lead to violent protests that don't create political change. Terrence Floyd spoke in Minneapolis at the spot where his brother died a week ago. An independent autopsy has found Floyd died as police restrained him and compressed his neck. One police officer has been charged with third-degree murder, and 3 other officers have been fired. Well, let's bring in DW's Stefan Simons in Minneapolis for more. Stefan, you're there at the place where the white police officer kneeled on Floyd's neck until he died, igniting outrage over a history of police brutality against Black people. What is the mood like where you are right now?
It's quite jubilant and very loose, so to speak. People are having a very good time. It's not a party, don't get me wrong. They're still very committed, chanting George Floyd's name. I can't breathe, the classic or typical battle cries now, which we have witnessed all week long. The curfew here in Minneapolis has been shrunk. It has been made shorter. The curfew now starts at 10 p.m. local. That means 2 hours later than yesterday and the other days before. So people are taking advantage of this here. This is absolutely, as you said, the ground zero of the ground zeros for what we experience here and across the United States for the last week. This is the spot where George Floyd actually died. And I can tell you something else. We asked a little bit around. There is nobody who could actually imagine right now that police would actually dare to roll in here and disperse this crowd in how many hours, whatever, whenever the curfew starts. So that would be probably a very difficult thing to do in terms of that would probably ruin the image of the Minneapolis Police Department entirely when they would go in here. So that's not to be expected, but we've been wrong before, right? However, people here are still having a good time, chanting. The crowd is changing a little bit. It was a family event throughout the day. A lot of kids, families, but people from all walks of life and all ethnicities and all colors, Black, Asian Americans, African Americans, white people, Latinos, everybody. Now, again, it's changing slightly. So there's younger people now. There's more people dressed in black coming up now. But still, good mood all around and all for and in the memory of George Floyd.
Well, Stefan, we've also heard that a fresh autopsy has ruled Floyd's death a homicide. What can you tell us about that and how that news is being received?
Mm-hmm. Well, yes, there is a new independent autopsy report out now, and that was initialized by the lawyers of the Floyd family because of course, the official autopsy report said nothing about that George Floyd died here through immense pressure on his back and his neck, which didn't allow oxygen and blood to flow to the brain. This autopsy report says clearly he died here because of those actions by those policemen. And people here, we said, well, we knew that all along.
DW's Stefan Simons in Minneapolis, thank you for your reporting.
The protests against the death of George Floyd have taken place outside the United States as well. Here in Berlin, there were demonstrations over the weekend, including outside the U.S. Embassy. Others in the German capital have been turning to art to show their support for the protests. Here's more.
In Berlin, protesters gathered for a third consecutive day in the city's main landmark, the Brandenburg Gate.
Call it out! Just say something!
In front of the U.S. Embassy and in the popular district of Neukölln.
No justice! No peace! No justice! No peace! No justice! No peace! No justice!
They are angry and they demand justice for George Floyd.
White people, look around.
In the north of the city, a mural as homage to George Floyd attracted many local residents who sympathize with the support shown for the protesters in the wider world. I think it's really good that these protests take place around the world. It shows that people take what happens seriously. But I see a difference here in Germany or in Europe. It's another level of racism than what exists in the US. I think it's important that such protests happen here too. It means we are aware of the situation. So yes, I'm all for it. It's not so cool that people aren't treated as they should be. Everyone is equal, regardless of their skin color. They're born that way and have the same rights. Here in Germany, thousands of people gathered over the weekend to show solidarity following George Floyd's death in the United States. Here behind me, you can see George Floyd's last words, "I can't breathe," on a mural which stands right where the Berlin Wall used to stand. This is highly symbolic, and it also shows that the struggle against racism is a global issue.
Let's talk about some of the global dimensions now with Sebastian Jobs. He's an historian and a U.S. analyst at the Free University here in Berlin. Sebastian, thanks so much for coming in today. We heard a protester in that report saying that racism here in Europe is different than the racism in the United States. How would you compare them?
I think we cannot look at the history of racism in the United States without regarding the history of slavery. And that means specifically that Black people became property of other people legally. Therefore, racism in the United States is specifically connected to a history of economic interests. And we can see, if we look to the history, if we have a look at the history of racism in the United States, we see a specific set of organizations, of institutions that supported to demonize Black people and keep them out of the political process.
Okay, and that's different than here in Europe. How would you qualitatively say it's different here in Europe, as we heard in our report?
Well, qualitatively, I think it is way more overt in the United States. We have racism in Europe as well, but very often we don't reflect upon it as well. But people of color are being discriminated in hiring processes. We have police violence against people of color in Europe as well, but it's not as open a topic, I think, as it is in the United States.
Well, President Trump says he wants to, on the one hand, protect the protesters and clamp down on looters and arsonists, that in his most recent address. What do you make of his law and order approach for doing that?
I think it's important to be aware that this kind of law and order rhetoric that goes back to the 1960s has always had a racial component, if you think about someone like Richard Nixon, who has invoked it very often. But what is very curious about the statement Donald Trump made last night is how he invoked a law that goes back to 1807, the Insurrection Act, that was specifically designed within the context of quelling slave insurrections and slave rebellions in the United States. And to me, that adds another layer of racial history and the history of racism that we can see in these instances at the moment.
Sebastian Jobs from the Free University here in Berlin. Thanks so much for coming in on this today.
Thanks for having me.